There's not a cow.
Good evening, everyone. I don't really, do I need this? Yes,
yeah. We have online. Yeah.
Oh, so there's people online. Okay. Welcome to tonight's presentation. Normally it's my Friday night class, but I'm really happy for many reasons to have Henry Rosemont taking this class over. You get to see me all the time, but it's very rare you get to see a scholar and a cultivator of his stature. To have a whole evening with him is really wonderful. I'll just say a few words. He said not to be long-winded, so I won't be. And I declined to sit up here because he said I'd have to stay awake then. Henry got his PhD from the University of Washington some years ago. He was a postdoctoral student in linguistics at MIT. Is that where you met Noam Chomsky, or later?
There.
And so a friend and colleague of Noam Chomsky, author of many articles and books. I'll just mention a few tonight. One is called The Chinese Mirror. The other one, Rationality and Religious Experience, that we helped put together. The other one is The Confucian Alternative, plus the translation that he has appeared that he and Roger Ames have just done, a new translation on the Confucian Analects. Very interesting. And most recently, probably what I think is his most concise and well-written work. It's called A Reader's Companion to the Confucian Analects. And I see it as a summary of many years of study and teaching and working with the text. So if you wanted to have a really succinct, clear introduction to the Confucian Analects and Chinese philosophy in general, I'd recommend that one. Henry was editor, book review editor for Philosophy East and West for many years as it got going in its early times, president of the Society for Asian Comparative Philosophy for many years, recipient of many grants, NEH, NSF, and so forth, Fulbright. He became a distinguished professor at St. Mary's College in Maryland, where he taught for many, many years, and then went to Brown University, where he is now still on the faculty of Brown, visiting professor in religious studies. And of course, teaches extensively and travels extensively to China, where he's taught at Fudan University and also at Johns Hopkins at their international studies. So he's been around, he's well-traveled, he's an old friend. I would say I've known him, or been privileged to know him, as a student of his. You will accept me as a student?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Both as a student and then as a colleague, and now I think mostly what I cherish is a very dear and close friend. And so I think three relationships make something of a Confucian Trinity. I don't know if it's holy, but it's certainly dear to me. So some of you know Henry, seen him before. I welcome him tonight, and look forward to his presentation. He's talking about translation and interpretation, many of the issues that we're wrestling with as we translate. And so please, welcome him. There'll be time for questions, I'm sure,
yes.
afterwards. So thank you all for coming.
Good, good. This is probably the 10th time I've had the privilege and the pleasure of sitting up here to visit with people and friends of the Berkeley Buddhist Monastery. I feel very comfortable here. I'm not a Buddhist. I'm much more a Confucian, I guess, but I feel very comfortable here. I've enjoyed all the people I've met. I've always had good conversations here, and I'm looking forward to another one this evening. I try hard never to talk at people, and I don't even really want to talk to you so much as talk with you tonight. I'm sure you have your own questions and issues about translation, and what the significance of why bother doing the translation, what deeper meanings lie there that we try to work with to uncover and learn from. So I will try to talk long enough to be provocative, but then open it up so we can have a discussion with each other and take comments and questions. I'll be working basically from 4 different texts where I've dealt with translation issues. I'm not a professional translator by any stretch of the imagination, but most of the materials I'll be doing with you this evening are taken either from Roger's and my translation of the Analects, or from this little reader's companion, which Marty kindly mentioned to you and flogged for me. I urge you not to buy the hardbound, which is what this is, because it's the ridiculous price of $45 for only 88 pages. And I'm learning that publishers are starting to do that now to discourage people from buying books and buying the electronic ones instead. So the electronic one is much less expensive, although I don't like electronic books myself, but I'm kind of stuck with it. I will also be taking a few things. We'll touch on the work that Houston Smith and I did in the book when he was giving the Xuanhua lecture. It's called, Is There a Universal Grammar of Religion? And we talked about some issues dealing with language. I did, especially because Houston said he was influenced by his former colleague at MIT, Noam Chomsky, so we took that up there as well. So, and then plus this article that I think that Marty handed out to you, the other article that Roger and I did, Issues in Translation and Interpretation. Bless your heart. Losing my slippers here. Most taken from that. Perhaps give you a little bit of advice. I will try not to lecture at you for what you ought to do and not do with respect to translation. A couple of very quick things, though, that have struck me as important over the years. One has been the joy of translating with someone else and not doing it solo. I've been deeply blessed by having someone as intelligent and warm and friendly and thoughtful as Roger Ames. It is, as Marty said, the same thing I share with Marty, colleague and friend now, and have been for some time, and we cherish the dual nature of the relationship. I do it with Roger as well. But you will always find a greater measure of security and confidence in what you've done when you've done it with someone else. Now, sometimes we kid. It's also nice now if someone points out a mistake in our translation, I can always say, Roger did that. But that's not why we've enjoyed translating together. We have felt much more confident with the results of what we have done than would otherwise be the case. The basis of our long and fruitful collaborations have been where we've struggled against a number of other translators who insist that it's kind of not a machine-like task, even though machine translation is becoming far more sophisticated with every passing day, but that it is becoming more of a science than anything else. And Roger and I resist that. We still see that translation is and always will be an art. It can become more sophisticated than it is as people grow more reflective and self-conscious about what they're doing. I'll make a few comments about that. But an art it will always be in the sense that there is no translation for us without interpretation. You must interpret in order to translate. A number of our colleagues in the field feel they can translate without imposing an interpretation, but certainly Roger and I don't, and we don't think many other philosophers do either. Our emphasis, though, is on philosophy, because at the end we want to ask what claim these ideas can have on our allegiance. You know, that's an important thing to ask. It's something that philosophers must ask. Other translators don't. I mean, there are at least two other splendid translators in the room. Michael Nyland is a Chinese historian at UCal Berkeley, and Marty himself, who has just finished a new translation of the Tanjing with Hong Shi. Their motives of translation are at least slightly different than what Roger and I were doing. They had somewhat different goals. And it isn't quite as important. Obviously, Marty is concerned with translating the Tanjing to make its spiritual qualities come alive as much as possible. And Michael is as concerned, especially with the work she's doing now on concept of pleasure and friendship in Han Dynasty text, to do the same. But they don't have to argue, if you will, for the case that they are trying to make. And philosophers usually do. We are expected to say, we can't take this seriously. Or this has to be taken seriously in a very different way than most of us are accustomed to. For example, after we finished translating the Analects, we translated the Shaojing, because we thought that had been misunderstood, very badly misunderstood, by a wide range of people for a long period of time. But there another text that deals with Shao, with what's called filial piety, which we called family reverence, is the Shao Shuo, 24 Tales of Filial Children. Well, most of those 24 children I find disgusting, covering themselves with honey in order to attract the mosquitoes away. I mean, they're just extreme fanatics about in their conduct toward filial piety. And I can't imagine anyone taking that seriously in the West in the 21st century. I can't imagine anyone in China taking it seriously. The text should probably be translated, because it can tell you about the evolution of the concept of Shao, from where it included a lot of remonstrance following through later periods of Chinese history, where obedience, unquestioning obedience, selflessness, just overwhelmed the concept in later history. So historians have to deal with that, but a philosopher does not have to deal with that. Moral of this little story is, you should ask when you read a translation, why did the translator translate it? What was his or her motive in doing the translation? What were they trying to do? Because it will have an impact. It will have some kind of an impact in that way. What words you choose, I also think that Roger and I are agreed you should always translate into your native language, never out of it. And some people are able to do so. There are some people who, very gifted writers, who write in English as if it was a native language, even though it isn't. Vladimir Nabokov and Conrad come to mind immediately. But the target language has nuances in it which I think are necessary for the audience to appreciate, for the text to come alive as much as possible. If you think about it, most classical texts, sacred texts, or just classical texts, literary texts, are retranslated almost every generation. There's a new translation of the Iliad now, and there's a new translation of the Aeneid. They're both but no new scholarship on ancient Greece or ancient Latin has come to light that would necessitate examining the Latin or the Greek. Why then new translations? Simple. The English language has changed. And people have different conceptions, different concerns, different worries, and so on. That's another reason I believe it is important to always translate into the target language. And the nuances can be which phrase you pick, which words you pick, can be very, very freighted. That has always been a bugbear for me because those of you who are older, I see no one in the room is as old as I am. But if any of you were close, if you remember the years of the Cold War, when Nikita Khrushchev was head of the Soviet Union, he came to the UN and he said something that has gone down and, of course, continued significantly to continuing and deepening the Cold War. He was quoted as saying at the UN General Assembly, "We will bury you." Now that's scary, isn't it? We will bury you. This is, of course, after they've been detonating a lot of nuclear weapons. And, of course, it gave us a good excuse for building up our own arsenal. But he was talking at the General Assembly to the unaligned nations largely, and he was talking about the significance of the difference between a planned economy and a market economy. Then he turned to the United States and said, "Our economy will soon be superior. We will leave you in the dust." Now think of the difference between those two expressions. The Russian is literally, I guess, "we will bury you." But the translator picked up on it, and there was another Russian scholar who said, "That's not the best. We will leave you in the dust," is far superior. Now, the Cold War wouldn't have ended, I don't think, if they had said that, but think of how much less spooky it might have been, how much people might have attended to what was really going on in a Russian leader's mind, because there's no reason to believe that Khrushchev didn't believe the planned economy would eventually surpass the capitalist economy because of its efficiency. There's a big difference between "we will bury you" and "we will leave you in the dust." I've never forgotten that. And it has stayed with me with issues of translations. Now, the next thing I say, worrying then about the nuances of the target language, and I want to take some concrete examples of that now, is what the translators think the text look like that they're working with. And let me say a few things then about what it would be like to work with the Bible and what it would be like to work with the Lunyi, because I have worked with the latter, not the former. But you might approach, especially the New Testament, maybe a little less the Hebrew Scriptures, asking, what are they trying to say? What are they trying to say? And that is a lot of what is going on in the Bible. You are getting many descriptions of what the world is like. In the beginning, God created it, going back to Genesis 1. Plagues were put on the pharaohs. The locusts came, facts about the world. So we might presume that a number of the authors of the text, of the Bible, were concerned to tell the way the world is, was, will be. That is, presenting a large amount of information about the world, of course in the context of it being revelation, some of the information being about God's ways. That's probably not the best way to look at the Analects, or at least the way that has always seemed to me the best way to look at the Analects. It's rather to ask, what is Confucius trying to do? Not what he's trying to say. What is he trying to do? And if you see that as a difference, it'll affect the translation you do. The answer that I came up with is he's trying to get his students to feel and act in particular ways. And that is straightforward to see for a philosopher if you're trained in philosophy. An awful lot of work has gone on in the philosophy of language for the last 75 years. And a huge difference has come up with a great deal of significance to it, and it's the difference between what you accomplish by saying something and what you accomplish in saying something. What are you trying to do? Are you trying to get people to understand something about the world, either a fact about the world or a theory that brings a lot of facts about the world together? Or are you trying to evoke a particular response in your listener? So, for example, to take the very famous passage 13:18 in the Analects, where the pretender Duke of Shi says, aha, there goes upright Kung. His father took a sheep on the sly, and his son turned him in. And Confucius says, aha, where I come from, son covers for his father, the father covers for his son, and therein lies being good. Now, if you just read that, it sounds like a kind of participant-observer anthropological observation. This is what we do in my village. But clearly, that's not why Confucius says that. He says, if your dad does something wrong, stick by him. That is what you have to evoke. He is trying to get a particular response from the student. It's in a declarative form. We have to put the sentence in declarative mood in English. In my village, a son covers for his father, and a father covers for his son. But that's not why he says that. It's a kind of imperative. Never squeal on your father. Don't do that. You will find it one of the most important passages in the entire Lunyi is 11:22, which I commend to your attention. And there you see most clearly where Confucius admits what he is doing. Ranyo comes in and he said, can I do this? Can I forge ahead in this activity? Confucius says, while your parents are alive, how dare you do something like that? And Lu comes in, asks the same question, and Confucius says, in essence, go get him. The third student comes in, he says, I'm confused. They both ask the same question. You tell one, no. You tell the other one, yes. Why is that? And he says, Ranyo is very diffident, so I had to encourage him. Tsulu has the energy of two, so I had to slow him down. Okay? The significance of knowing the student, having a good sense of where the question is coming from, and therefore trying to give an answer that fits that particular student because he's trying to evoke a particular response. So that would mean that overall, when we look at the Lunyi, if we wanted to ask about any of the statements in it, we wouldn't ask whether or not the statement is true, as we would if we're describing facts. We would rather perhaps say we do what is appropriate. Is what the Master said appropriate? Now, that of course is an interpretation. What strengthens the interpretation is there is no word for true in classical Chinese. So it would be very strange to see that talk about facts the way things, there's no word for fact either in classical Chinese per se, not simply, not there. It would rather be appropriate. And the Chinese, of course, do have that term. What you say may be appropriate to what you're trying to inculcate in the student, or it may not be. That's good. Whether it's true or false is kind of secondary. And there is a word for appropriate. Yi. Very common term. You are always to do what is yi, and that is what is appropriate. Not just talking, but all of it. That's usually translated as righteous, or sometimes as moral. But both of those, we think, are wrong. Righteous immediately brings to bear, of course, again, a Christian moral orientation, or a Hebraic or an Islamic. And righteousness, of course, is something that's out there. It's an objective standard which we are expected to meet. But to do what's appropriate with Zulu and what's appropriate with Ranyo and what might be appropriate with Yanhui is not anything that is a universal principle or could be or couldn't be righteous or unrighteous. It would be appropriate or inappropriate. And that would be the same for behavior as well. So this suggests that we're entering a somewhat different world than we're accustomed to. This was trying to be sensitive to staying with the fact that unlike the Bible, the Lunyi is recording oral. It's an oral tradition. Of course, there are some books in there, and Confucius exhorts everyone, including his son, to study the odes. They have to. But the book itself is made up of brief of talk, oral thing. And so an appropriate translation of the Analects and reading of the Analects will focus on the nature of the conversation. And that means it's essential at all times to know who is asking the question that Confucius is responding to. You have to be, we thought it was important to be attentive to that when we were doing the translation. We believe it's very important for readers to attend to it. I take this up in this little book here. It is also the case then, now that coming to the notion of morals, how you pick another theme that we have taken as of importance. No, let me stay with the Bible and the Analects a little more. The analogy, I think, is a good one, because you can, of course, start with Genesis and learn how it all began. It's been downhill ever since. But for the most part, and especially with the New Testament, you can open the book almost anywhere. You can open it in the middle, you can open it here, you can open it there. You don't have to read, you can read John before you read Luke, and you can read Mark before you read Matthew. You don't have to read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in that order. They're there, and there are puzzles, of course, concerning the text. It's the same way with the Analect. It doesn't even make much sense to have to begin with 1 and then end up at 20. Beginning with 1:1, it can be nice because it tells you this strictly secular humanistic context that the book is going to be about. But none of us know why the editors chose to have 1:1 be 1:1. We don't know that. We're not even sure when 1:1 was set down as opposed to when 6:1 was set down, or 6:13 or another. We can come close, but we can't be exact. So you look at the book in a different way. In an important sense, the Lunyi isn't even a book. In the sense that it doesn't have a single author or authors. It isn't a narrative that goes from beginning to end. It doesn't give you an overall world view. Different people can infer world views from it, which have a measure of validity. But there's no be-all and end-all. And of course, you must read the Bible if you can find out, what do Christians believe? For that, you must read the Bible. What do Jews believe? And there, of course, you need the Hebrew Scriptures, otherwise called the Old Testament, and ditto for the Quran. There, what do Muslims believe? But it's probably not best to open the Analects to ask what Confucius believed, because he doesn't spend much time telling you. You'll notice also, what did Confucius mean by Ren? And I'll bet if you've looked at the Analects at all, you've been confused. You're not sure what Ren means. Well, you can draw sustenance from the fact that none of the students did either. They're asking them about it all the time. And he gives them different answers. It is probably best just to transliterate that, give a big gloss, and then simply say Ren, and leave it at that. Suggesting, of course, there is more than one valid interpretation. The way the Ren of Zulu, if he achieved it, will be different than the Ren of Yanhui when he achieved it. It will not necessarily, it doesn't seem to me, from the way Confucius discusses it, that it means the same thing. So there is no be-all and end-all Ren up there in the sky, if you will, as there is, and I don't mean to put Plato down for this, but the idea or the form of justice is eternal, unchanging, and so on. And that doesn't have an analog, I think, with Ren. Ren is something that different human beings embody in different ways. And he's trying to get each student to embody it as best he can, given his personality, his history, his age, his hopes and fears and goals and things like that. Now, there are, now from that, let me go then to the notion of the morals. There is no word for morals in Chinese, and a lot of people have yelled at me for saying, well, that's everything from I'm unfair to babies, because babies certainly should have concepts without a term to express them, which is what my claim has been, or that I think one person has said I committed the lexical fallacy, which is an altogether different kind of fallacy, if indeed I committed one. But you have to be suspicious to attribute a very important concept to a text which has no lexical item for it. There's no guarantee that Confucius shouldn't be called a moral philosopher. But on the other hand, there isn't much evidence for it either. And you certainly can't call him a theoretician of morality. I can't imagine how you could say someone was a theoretician of X if there is no term for X in the lexicon of that language. I first put this in a discussion with Herbert Finger at a review of his wonderful book, Confucius, The Secular is Sacred. When I say there's no term for something in a language, it doesn't mean that the people couldn't do the things that are usually done. That is, the idea that there's no verb form for, say, the word skip in a particular language doesn't mean that the people who speak that language couldn't go skipping. But if there is no term for skipping in there, it'd be very hard to find a theoretician of skipping in their written literature, because you'd never know when you'd coming across it. But worse than that, if you think about what is it like to have a moral discussion? Moral discussion. What, and I'm now picking up on some of the themes that are in the essay on translation and interpretation. What other terms do we need in order to talk about a moral problem? Why does someone who is pro-life look so horribly at a woman who chooses an abortion? Well, because she was free to have chosen otherwise. Yes? Yes, she faced a dilemma, a conflict between what to do. But she chose freely, because she's an autonomous individual, to do what the pro-life person would say is murder or something close to it. Think of the terms we have to use for any discussion about morality. We need the word choice. We need the word rationality. We need the word freedom, autonomy, liberty, dilemma, ought. All of those terms cluster around the term morals in contemporary English for the description, analysis, and evaluation of human conduct. Why I dug in my heels on morals, not wanting to call Confucius a moral philosopher, because none of those terms appear in classical Chinese. There isn't even a word for ought as such, or choice, or freedom, much less morals. So if you try to make Confucius out to be a moral philosopher, when the entire basic vocabulary of what we consider important for contemporary moral philosophy is absent, what are you going to get? Someone who reads like a damn fool, or a well-meaning preacher at best. You're not going to get a serious thinker, a profound thinker. And that, of course, is one reason most Western philosophers have simply ignored Confucianism ever since the translations first began coming around. So, as a translator, I've focused on the notion of a concept cluster. Concept cluster. When you want to attribute a particular idea to a person, think of in your target language, i.e. your native language, then think about the other terms that cluster around it and see how many of them you can find. And if you don't find very many, you should be very nervous about attributing the basic concept to them. The concept cluster, and I'm going to stay with that a little while. Even in English, you'll find different concept clusters at different periods of time. In the late medieval, early Renaissance period, for example, the description, analyses, and evaluation of human conduct centered on the concept of honor. And you had words like chivalric, you had sakes, you had shents, boons, liegeful, varlet, gentle, villain. Those are the words that clustered around honor. But we don't use those today. That's not the way we hold moral discussions. And most of those words we don't even know, except as you remember reading Robin Hood when you were young. It's not there. I assume you all use the expression, for Pete's sake or for goodness sake. How many of you know what a sake is? Who knows what a sake is? There it is. It was a very important word in moral thinking during the medieval period. Or go a little more farther west or east, depending on what direction you started from. Dharma, karma, moksha, dukkha, varna, nirvana. There's another concept clustered around the notion of dharma. When Hindus want to talk about descriptions, analyses, and evaluation of human conduct, that's the concept cluster we use. And there do not have parallels anywhere. Nobody would dream of trying to translate at least karma and dharma. They try with moksha, they try to make it salvation, which is not a particularly good use. But Roger and I, we see that as very important for issues of translation. When you want to work with a text, look, and you're focusing either on the spiritual dimensions. Okay, if it's going to be spiritual dimensions, you think of theology, think of grace, think of prayer, think of the words that kind of cluster around that in your native tongue and see what kind of analogs there are or are not, and what they do use to talk about those kinds of things in the language. And that's a nice check on you. You'll be much less inclined to use the word moral to translate E when you realize that none of the other terms we associate with it are found in the same way in classical Chinese. The perniciousness of that, at least for myself, and at least for Roger, and for at least a few others, is that when you do those impositions, you're not letting the other speak for themselves. See, it has been, when we talk about translation, no translation without interpretation, we have worked hard to try to find an interpretation that takes the text on its own terms and not on the terms that we want to impose on it. Now, for me, that came easy because none of the terms that are key for me as a Western philosopher are to be found in the classical text. So I had to look somewhere else to try to find out what the text might be saying that would be of contemporary value to us. And of course, the tightrope you must always walk is how to give the otherness the others their full otherness without making them wholly other. When you make them wholly other, you can dismiss them. You can treat them as like so many grains of sand on the beach. I don't have to pay attention to this. This can't be serious. kind of thing, and you can keep your kind of cultural sense of superiority and condescension toward the other, or not even care about them, not even care about how much collateral damage is being done in Pakistan and Afghanistan with our drones. They seem so other, so wholly other. There's nothing place to connect, to get us to think about them as fellows in any sense. At the same time, Afghan beliefs and Pakistani beliefs are different than ours. So how do you walk that tightrope of giving the others their otherness without making them wholly other? Those are some of the concerns that we have had. I do hope you will take the idea of concept clusters seriously, and if you're doing translation on your own or working with it, because it can really serve as a check for yourself. I'm inclined to use this term in English for that term in the source language. Now, what other terms are immediately conjured up in English? And I look, are there similar things conjured up in the source language? Now, to move a little bit to the page I gave you here, another source of not so much difficulty, but you all know the expression junzi. You know it means superior man, nobleman, gentleman. I think there is somebody else has just done a new one like that. And gentleman is the most common, well, it's the most famous because it's the one that Arthur Whaley used in his wonderful translation, now almost 80 years old. But Whaley was an Englishman. He started beginning the translation of the Analects in the 1920s. And gentleman meant something not altogether dissimilar from what I think junzi means. But we don't live in England. We live in America. And overwhelmingly, we see the word gentleman only on the door of men's rooms. We don't use the word very often. When we do, we tend to think of stuffed shirts of one kind or another. So gentleman doesn't seem appropriate to us. Moreover, it's also always been the case that it seemed to me, if we look, I'm not a scholar at all of later Confucianism, but it does seem that Confucianism had an incredible ability to adapt to changing times. I do know that Confucius would probably recognize the Confucianism of his name put forward by Zhu Xi, but maybe just barely. Maybe just barely. It's very different. And of course, the Confucianism of Wang Yangming is different from that of Zhu Xi, as well as it is, and on and on and on. The Confucianism of Tseng Guofan, Kong Yue, and so on is different from the Confucianism of others. It's been able to adapt to different times and circumstances. Well, we are hopefully coming to a decline in things like sexism in the West. We're trying to, if you will, to really push equality, and especially gender equality in our work. So translating this as superior man not only is condescending, it's sexist. So is gentleman, sexist. So is nobleman, sexist. Now, everybody wants to say, yeah, but it really was a patriarchal society, wasn't it? It really was oppressive, sexist, and so on. Well, it's not clear, at least for the Confucians, that they were quite as sexist as they were pointed out to be. Mozi, for example, berates them for treating women as equal with most of the rituals in a passage about the Confucians. Some of Michael Nyland's wonderful work has been to show that, at least for middle-class women, they wouldn't have preserved the classics had it not been for them, their erudition and their education and so on, not particularly oppressed and so on. Very great work. I've learned much from Michael in that and in other regards as well. But more important, the classical Chinese language is not marked for gender. It's not marked for case. It's not marked for number. So one way to have the grammar completely on your side is simply to take another term, and Roger and I were absolutely convinced that exemplary persons was the best because of the importance of model emulation for Confucian education, beginning in the Analects itself. Exemplary persons, and therefore the pronoun is automatically they. We have the grammar on our side, and we have a much less off-putting translation for 50% of our readership, namely the women. Indeed, we've had 3 now women instructors thank us for that. If the Confucianism is going to say something to the 21st century and speak, it ought to have as little jarring a language to it as possible. It ought to be smooth and that. So, say, but it's, now, are we distorting the language? Well, we've got the grammar. Are we misleading? Well, I don't know. I don't think so. But we like to think that we're, at least in the spirit of Confucianism, trying to get across the best we can with the contemporary times. Clearly what you're seeing from this then is that how deeply we must feel is deeply sensitive to the nuances of the contemporary world in which we live as we are to the ancient world in which produced the text that we're trying to work from. They are, but neither one is, to our mind, more important than the other. They are equally significant. Another example, and then maybe I will try to start to open this up to things that you would like to do, is, or maybe a couple of examples having to do with grammar and so on. From this page I gave you from 111, that Fu Cai Guan Qi Zhi, Fu Mei Guan Qi Xing, San Nian Wu Gai Yi Fu Zhi Dao, Ke Wei Xiao Yi. Now, let me give you the way that passage is translated by a number of our colleagues. It's 111 in the text, by the way. By Jane Legge translated it, if for 3 years he does not alter from the ways of his father, he may be called filial. Arthur Whaley, if for the whole 3 years of mourning he manages to carry on the household exactly as in his father's day, then he is a good son indeed. Raymond Dawson, the Oxford translator, if for 3 years he makes no changes from the ways of his father, he may be called filial. And finally, D.C. Lau, Roger's teacher, Roger had to worry about this. If for 3 years he makes no changes to his father's ways, he can be said to be a good son. Now, at least for us, native speakers of English, these 4 translations all share the implication that if the son does this for 3 years, you can jolly well be sure he's going to do it for the rest of his life and therefore will be a good son indeed. That really does suggest the classical conservatism, arch conservatism of the Confucian way of life. You simply do it as they used to do it. Now the key word there is gai. Gai. And it has a number of meanings. It has, one is to change, to alter, to correct, and to reform. To reform. So we made it, if for 3 years the son refrains from reforming the ways of his father, he is a filial son. Now, we don't think that does any violence whatsoever to the text, to the nature of the text. Refrains from reforming is within the semantic range, directly semantic range of the term gai, but I hope you too will see there is a difference in the nuance of meaning to that. It doesn't say he can't refrain. He can't change. He says he shouldn't do it for the first 3 years. And that is very Confucian. Don't give up the old until you've tried it, if you will. Make sure you understand what's going on before you make a change, to appreciate that the change is really needed, and what used to be good is no longer, what function the old ways used to serve are no longer being served. We don't think the other translations capture that, or at least in our own intuitions about our native language, we did that. Now clearly this means an interpretation again for us. We do not think Confucius just was a kind of old stick in the mud. We do think there was a dynamism in there, and he was not opposed to changing things. The hemp cap, when you can change the ways, if there's a good reason for changing the ritual, you change the ritual. You don't do it willy-nilly, you don't do it first crack out of the box. And then of course there's also chapter 15 of the Shaojing. If you don't remonstrate, you're not a good son. You're not a good minister. He just beats up on saying, how could you possibly say that loyalty is the key to being filial? If a ruler doesn't have anyone who will remonstrate with him, he can't be a ruler. He's got to have 7 ministers who will remonstrate with him. If the father doesn't have any children who will remonstrate, he can't be a good father. That's very clear in the text. When things are not going well, you must remonstrate. Now Roger and I take that as an integral part of the Confucian persuasion. And that's why we did this translation rather than just follow along with the others. We're close, but we saw it as somewhat different. Now there are other themes about when you can, other things having to do with the nature of the language. I'll just make comment quickly on Analects 12:11 and then line 1 of the chapter 1 of the Tao Te Ching, why they're in there. Classical Chinese, as you know, is almost wholly an analytic language in the sense it's not inflected. Apart from a context, no character has a singular grammatical function. That is, it's only in a context that you can say, aha, this should be a verb, this should be a noun, this should be an adjective, this should be an adverb. It's not there. Classical Chinese does not unambiguously express grammatical relations, as most Indo-European languages do and modern spoken languages do. More than that, Roger and I said it seems to be the case that nouns default to verbs in classical Chinese. It is more of an event language than a thing language. And so when we came to that famous passage on 12:11, which is usually called the rectification of names, we prefer to think of it as the rectification of roles, but that's another story. And it's a very simple thing. It simply runs jun jun, chan chan, fu fu, ci ci. And it's translated usually as the ruler should rule, the minister should minister, the father should be a father, and the son should behave like a son. And of course, talking about more like in terms of essences. But the dynamism comes out a little better, and again stays very close to the Chinese of itself. The ruler rules, the minister ministers. The father fathers, and the son sons. Now, we thought a bit about before translating it that way, in part because the ruler rules, that's straightforward. Nobody has any trouble with that with English. Minister's minister is maybe minimally suspect because we usually think of a minister ministering to his flock, which of course is not necessarily what an official would do, i.e. Secretary of State or the Prime Minister or something like that. But it's okay. Father, father, well, that usually in that way, to father something means to sire. That is, it's biological, and we weren't sure that might confuse, but then we thought we'd get it all back by saying the son, sons, which is positively ungrammatical in English, and we knew that, of course. But that was why we do think that captures the spirit as well as the letter of the text. And how do you know that a person is a good son? Not by inner qualities, by how well he sons, how well he engages in sonning. What makes him a good ruler? Not inner qualities of loving the people or things like that. It's how ably he rules. You see the qualities in the action. You see that in the behavior. And that seems straightforward to us sufficiently. We haven't caught any flack for that one, for the son's son. But we think, again, but you see how heavily involved what the way we interpret the text has affected the way we have elected to translate it. That's why this is so thick. We have written so much more than the translation itself because we felt we were obliged to tell you what we thought had some sense of what we thought the text was about, and we had to tell you in great detail what we thought the English language was about and what the Chinese language was about, so you would kind of know where we stood and could therefore evaluate the text on its own. Now, let me just say a couple of words about, again, the huge difference and the lack of precision with respect to grammatical relations. We think about line 1 of the Tao Te Ching, Dao Ke Dao, Fei Chang Dao, Ming Ke Ming, Fei Chang Ming. Why is it clear that the first and the third Tao are to be treated as nouns, and the second as a verb? Never mind what verb, whether it's to speak or to travel or whatever. But how do we know that before we had punctuated texts? Why couldn't we parse that Dao Ke, Dao Fei, Chang Dao? I can give a meaning to that. The Tao that you can kind of get to and the Tao that you can't, both part of the unchanging Tao. What prohibits that reading? I know a lot of you here know classical Chinese very well. Why can't it be read that way? And the only answer is because the commentators never read it that way. It is historical, not philological or etymological, that this is the way the text must be read. See, you don't get the purely grammatical cues about how to parse the sentence, how to punctuate it. It has to come from something else. So, in his book, The Parting of Taoism, The Parting of the Way, Holmes well said, to read the Tao Te Ching is an act of creation. And indeed, one of the things my own mentor in graduate school asked me to promise him was I would never try to translate the Tao Te Ching. There were already 140 translations when I was a graduate student. That's almost 50 years ago now. I think it's up to about 175 or 180. But I would say there's a sense, there's an active creation in all translations from the Chinese, because it is so different grammatically, graphically, orthographically, and so on. And the ways of those thinkers are very different. But I don't think they're that different that we can't get to them. But we do have to, I think, appreciate their differences and give them their differences and try to make sense of their differences before we can see how they are indeed like us. Now, is that enough to begin generating some discussion, I hope? It is, or about anything else that you might want to ask me about? Yes, ma'am.
Going back to your example that you gave of the son being filial by following his father's, principles after 3 years of departing from him. But what if, the father wasn't a very good father, like during Confucius' time? Because, it's more corrupt now, right?
I gave a talk to the Center for Chinese Studies on Monday, and of course I was asked that. What happens if I was talking about family values there, and they said, what happens if you have an abusive father? I think, or it's usually abusive ruler, but it's either abusive ruler or abusive father. I've probably been asked that 300 times. over the course of my trying to make a pitch for the Confucians. And, but it's a very straightforward, honest question. Yes, we know we're supposed to fulfill our roles, be loyal children, remonstrate. But suppose your father or the ruler that you're supposed to serve is really a loser. What does Confucius have to say? And he does have something to say, and I am going to answer your question. Actually, I'm glad you asked it. But when you ask the question, you're kind of looking for some kind of a guideline, a principle, a rule that might follow of how you handle an abusive father. And that's because we tend to think of morality, we're looking for universal principles. We want to know whether it's the categorical imperative or I'm blanking on the utility principle. Something like that. But Confucianism is exquisitely particularistic. You are always supposed to do what is appropriate with the person you're interacting with. See, that's another way we see early Confucian morality is different. It's not just what you are doing that's appropriate or inappropriate. It's what you are doing with whom at what time. So what might be appropriate on one occasion will not be appropriate on another occasion, sometime even with the same person. Certainly over time. There was a time when I was totally dependent on my parents. I was the beneficiary, they were the benefactor, and I was to be loyal, and I was to be obedient, and so on. And when they got old, I became benefactor. And it was my job then to care in a very different kind of way. But even within that, I am benefactor to my friend when she needs my help, beneficiary when I need hers. That's the way things go. Now, what that means is, the better I know the person, whether it's a student, one of my children, grandchildren, friend, neighbor, the better I know them, the higher the probability that I'll be able to do what's appropriate, ascertain what's appropriate, okay? What do I need to know? I need to know them, and I need to know my own strengths and weaknesses, okay? Look within. When you see somebody behaving well, very well, what does Confucius say? Look within. When he sees somebody behaving very badly, what are you going to do? Look within. You've got to examine how you live that role. Okay. Now, you're serving what you are supposed to do. Every good Confucian should serve the government if asked to do so. And there's even a hint that the way may prevail in the state. If not now, then maybe next week. So you go serve this ruler. And he's not just a bad ruler. He's a world-class SOB. Really bad news. What to do? Now, if you say, well, there's no answer to the question, but I can tell you what you should do. You must think of that ruler and say, this ruler. Not rulers in general, because most rulers, most of the time, are losers. But this ruler, is he reformable? Is it possible that his mischievous ways could be changed? This one, not in general, again, particular, specific. This one I'm serving. Okay? If the answer is yes, the next question is, do I have the capacity and the ability to reform him? Does he trust me? Can I bring myself to try to like him enough? Do I have the skills of being articulate? Can I do it? If I answer honestly that question, yes, I have a model, King Wen. You all know who King Wen is, yes. He's the one who is serving a very bad Shang emperor. He has the Zhou fiefdom, and he continues to serve even though the ruler is bad. He says, stop it, stop it. You're a bad guy, change your ways. The ruler never changes his ways. At great danger to his life, but King Wen keeps remonstrating with him, never winning though he dies. But there is a model. He is a model to follow. Now, if the answer to the first question is yes, the ruler is reformable. But I don't have the skills, requisites, I dislike him too much, or I'm not articulate enough, or he doesn't know me, whatever it is, I can't do it, then I must simply resign. And Confucius becomes my model. You know that you don't have to be in office to serve the government in that. He retires. If the answer to the question, is he reformable, is no, I have another model. King Wu, who is the son of King Wen, who overthrows the evil Shang emperor and establishes the longest-lived dynasty in Chinese history. In any case, I have a model. I have something to do. So in that, if you say, what do I do about my abusive father? How could I possibly tell you what to do? You have to. How bad is your father? Why is he doing these things? Can you change him? It may be in the end you got to call 911, but you don't do that first, right? The first time your father is abused, that's not what you do. So there is no generalization you can make. It doesn't mean there isn't an answer to the question. Okay?
Thank you.
Yeah.
And by the way, it's not my father. I'm just
Pardon?
generalizing.
What? Well, I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. No, I know. It'd have to be a good father to raise such a wonderful young lady. Oh, yeah. Please, very good. Other questions? Comments? Yes, sir.
One of the passages you used the time issue of 3 years, and I'm curious as to how you interpret the differences of how time was viewed. We think of things in the Julian calendar, but what does time really mean? Is it really 3 years we're talking about here, or is there some aspect of that that's sort of a concept rather than an actual amount of time we're talking about?
Well, throughout most of it, the mourning period was roughly 27 months, 2 years in a season, or part of a season. And it was the strenuous part of it. I mean, there were, as you came out, I think more people did more things. But the important thing was always what you felt was appropriate. I mean, Confucius obviously doesn't like a fellow who says he thought 1 year was more than enough. But he says, if you feel like that, well, then that's when you should stop mourning. I think there is the insight that time heals the wounds. And it is it the mourning period strictly the time you were asking about, or just time in general?
Yeah, I was just more in terms of, we might interpret it as being, well, exactly 3 years. And I'm thinking, well, maybe that's not what they really meant when he said that from your interpretation.
I think the extra time, okay, that's a very good question, and you're obliging me to think a little differently. Yeah, I've been trying to wrestle with the issue because English is so kind of individually concerned. I can't get away from the first person singular and thinking about myself. But there does seem to be just enough passages, not just in the Lunyi, but in a lot of classical texts, that suggest that you are to see yourself, to identify yourself in part with those who are dead and with those who will be coming later. You are not so much an individual as part of a family. It does not mean you are any part of a faceless collective. That is, for me, Confucius, the opposite of, or the antithesis of individualism is not collectivism, whether it's yellow peril, blue ants, or any of the other bad propaganda things, but it is more of I am part of something larger than myself that is there before me and will be there after me, so that you can really see the importance. You can't think when you're 15 about the importance of returning your body intact. Now, why? Well, my body is my body. It's not my parents'. Somehow there seems to be a way of educating, or that Confucius wanted his students to see, well, you are part of them. You are part of them. And life will be different for you if you see yourself in that way. as very deeply embedded in them. Now, you don't do the 3 years of mourning if you lose a child. It's only for your parents. And my sense is when you lose your parents, you're on the way to becoming the patriarch of the group. And maybe that's a good time for you to attend to what the new role will be as the person now, if you will, in charge of younger siblings and grandchildren as well as children or whatever it is. I'm speculating here. I'm nothing definitive. But I would tend to think there is something like that. It is only for the parents that you do this. And I think that has, and of course when your parents die, then, well, you may have an older brother, but it will be that you're on your way to, I say, becoming the patriarch, and therefore the weight of the family traditions and the ritual and so on is now going to fall on you. And therefore, getting ready for it might be a very helpful thing to do.
Yeah, I like that, because I think, when I think time in Christianity, you think the world was created in 6 days, and then the seventh day you rest, and I think, I don't accept that as a time concept, so that's why I wondered that.
Well, there is a sense in which the past lives on in different ways, by the fact that you've got the little ritual place for where the ancestors are, which of course the Chinese still do with the photographs and things like that. It lives on. Even back in when you read the Shijing, the odes, the ritual poetry is how the personator, the Shi, the person who sits in for the ancestor is there, literally talks to you. That you ask for, you play, whenever possible, it'll be a grandchild of the deceased. And you ply this grandchild with food and drink and so on, and you ask for the blessings. And uniformly, I guess, the blessings were bestowed. But you almost physically hear the ancestor still talking. There are passages in the Li Ji, in the books of ritual, where the purification rituals you have to go through before performing the high ritual, before these rituals of sacrifice that are described in the Shijing, are done. And by the way, because of these purification rituals, I tend to read Book 10 of the Analects, which describe Confucius's ritual attendance in great detail, a little differently than others. But it talks about as you go through the purification rituals, you will come to see them. You will hear them. Clearly, the intensity with which you discipline yourself in the purification before the sacrifice is working to jog your memory and make the ancestors more vivid again. This is the way he dressed. This is the way she laughed. This was the sound of her laughter. That, of course, gives you that feeling of continuity again. The ancestors stayed alive, and there were names to be known for 5 generations. After that, they just went into the fog of the ancestors, the high ancestors. Why 5? Why not 3? Why not 17? Why 5? Well, I'm generation 1. My father's generation 2. Surely I will know my father unless I'm extremely unfortunate. There's a good chance I will know my grandfather too. Only if I'm very lucky will I know my great-grandfather. But my father and my grandfather may well have told me tales about my great-grandfather. And then one more, and that's 5. It is possible for me to have memories of my grandfather talking about his grandfather or grandmother or others of the times. Can't have known my great-great-grandfather on his own. Again, here I'm speculating, but there is something to that. Those are within the possibilities of memory for me to contemplate as I purify myself for the sacrifice, honoring these people, and of course making me feel like I'm part of them. And as my grandchildren attend, and maybe even one of my grandchildren is the personator, I of course will feel the bond with tomorrow as well as yesterday. Thanks for that question. Another question, comment? We're a little off from translation, but that's fine. Yes, in the back there, please. Yes, ma'am.
I was just wondering, when you start to translate a piece, where do you translate it, and how much do you start by yourself, and when do you decide to collaborate with others? Can you speak a little more to that process?
Well, I try to translate, then I look at everybody else who's already done the translation to see how badly I've done it. And then try to work from there. And I haven't done any translations published as such, except for the two I've done with Roger, I mean, at length. When I quote something, I will say either my translation or modified from Legge or Whaley or whatever, but those are just short snippets of things in one little passage, and I'll do those. So I'm not the best, in that question it would be better for you to ask Marty or Michael, because actually Marty is been collaborating with Hung Shi here, and I don't know, Michael, whether you've collaborated or not, or whether you have collaborated. My work with Roger has been exemplary for both of us, so because his Chinese is better than mine, and he is more deeply steeped in the text than I am, but I've had some more linguistics, and I have a little more playful attitude with the English language. And so we almost never argue. I mean, when it comes down to I say this for the Chinese and he says that, we tend to do that. And when it's with the English and he says this and I say that, then we do my that. But these are very, very rare. We will play, I guess the way we've done the two texts so far is he's done the first translation and I've done the introductions, and then we switch. He redoes the introduction, I redo the translation, and then we go back and argue a little bit and then refine and do this and that way. That's been the method that we have used. Now, if that's in part, that's because we've wanted such very lengthy introductions, both to the text and to our system of translation, but that is what we have done, and it's worked wonderfully for us, yeah. Yes, sir, head cameraman. Or secondary cameraman.
So you mentioned about word of cluster of words.
Shema?
Concept of clusters.
Yeah.
So meaning when you have a concept of clusters, then that's a point you are ready to translate. Is that right?
The notion of a concept cluster, we will do that tentatively if, depending on what we think is the importance of the term, how crucial it is, how many times it's employed, and so on. And then we will take what other terms seem to be central to it and see how much they circle around the term that we're thinking of using from the source language. But go ahead with your question, then I'll try to, I don't think I'm responding well.
Right. Feels like that trying to translate, say, from Chinese to English, one need to have enough capacity to come up with that concept of clusters.
Yeah.
To be able to translate properly, to communicate that, what you try to translate. Is that true? That's what I got from.
Right.
And also that also reflect my experience.
Right. Yes, what we do, see, the cluster would come close to, for xin, ren zibang yin, we would use authenticity, trust. For ren, we used to use authoritative person, then we switched to consummate person or consummate conduct for ren person. Now we just don't want to translate it at all. Along with tian, we can't find a good analog for tian. So we didn't, even in the Analects, we didn't do that. But we do have a concept cluster for the Chinese. Zhi we make realize rather than know most of the time. Occasionally it should be acknowledgement, occasionally it should be knowledge or wisdom. Most of the time realize works much better, because real in English, See, you can't know something if you can't realize something that isn't true in the same way you can't know something that isn't true. So it has that, if you will, semantic function. But realize also has the sense of to make real. And of course that means to put into practice. And that we see as of the essence. We do like, that's why we use appropriate rather than right or wrong or righteous or moral or things like that. So those form the kind of concept cluster for Zerlunyi. Those, putting them together in that way, they have their own, we think, integrity, they hang together, and they tell a story and they express a vision of what it is to be a human being in a decent community. But maybe I'm still not addressing your question.
I think it's you answered the question mostly. So I think where I'm coming is, seems to translate, say from the sutra from Chinese to English, one need to have very good English skill to be able to translate properly, because only at that point then you can come up with that concept of clusters.
Oh, in general, yes. I would not trust any native English speaker, single language English speaker, to translate into Chinese. Putonghua or Wenyan or take your pick. I just wouldn't trust it.
So it seems it's English safe to translate from English, Chinese to English. English native language speaker can probably do a better job.
Yes.
Than a native Chinese speaker.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. And the reverse is also true. A Chinese will do a much better job translating from English to Chinese than a native English speaker will. I mean it both ways. My argument is that you should always translate into the target language. Right. Into your native language. The target language should always be your native language. Whether it's German and Polish, or Russian and French, or whatever. Russians should translate from French into Russian.
Okay, yeah.
And French should translate from Russian into French. Yeah, I mean it's absolutely general. Because each language, I say, has a range of nuances of meaning, colloquial expressions, and simple cultural variations. Even apart from the nuances of language, French culture there are currents in Paris now, intellectual, aesthetic, artistic, creative, that are different than the cultural patterns and dynamics in Moscow or St. Petersburg. So someone who is translating today in Moscow or St. Petersburg has to be able to cast the French, at least minimally, into terms that will be understood and appreciated by the cognoscenti in Moscow or St. Petersburg, I would say.
That answers my question.
Okay.
I do see some, not other examples, that translate pretty well is from Chinese to English. That is the English professor. He paired with a Chinese professor, and that seems to work out pretty well. So I'm wondering if the pairing, wondering if this pairing team translation is a better system to translate.
Oh, well, you could have, you mean someone I would translate with a native speaker of Chinese? Is that what you're saying? Could I also do
Not
that?
necessarily native speaker, but more familiar with the language to be translated from.
Well, yes, that could go on, but I would want the person who was the most familiar with the Chinese to be pretty good in English, and I would want the English speaker to be at least minimally good in Chinese. So you'd have to get it that way. Yeah.
I usually don't. I have the privilege of asking you questions all the time, but you got me thinking as usual again. So if we go back, which is something I wrestle with, what is the person trying to say versus what you said? What are they trying to do? In other words, what's the affect they're wanting to have? Then how do you figure out whether your translation into English, say the Linyu, has the affect on the reader that someone reading it in the Chinese has? In other words, how do you make that equivalent? How do you gauge that so they're actually having a similar affect, even though the words that you use in English would be quite different than the words and the meaning in the Chinese? How do you measure that? How do you get at that? Does that make sense?
No, it makes enormous sense. And there is, if I could answer it, I'd probably be more famous and wealthy. It's a first-rate question. I can say it, and I want to say something about the translation that you're doing. Clearly, I read the Analects as Confucius is trying to get his students to feel and think and be in a certain way. And obviously it's in a way to be concerned for and about others, to be aware of the foibles of those you are interacting with, as well as all their qualities, to be able to appreciate the importance of formality and things like that. And so that gives me at least rough and ready, will the English convey that? So probably very infrequently will we want to use a colloquial expression or a slang expression, because that would get you away from some of the formality. In the same way, most newer translations of the Bibles don't work as well as King James because it is so lofty language. English is so beautiful. You almost want to become a Christian even if you never were before, because the English is so beautiful, no matter what else. But you can't be sure. You can just do the best you can with what you've got, in a sense. But that will put it to you, answering the question, what did I think Confucius was trying to do? You have to ask us, if you ask, the Buddha was not necessarily doing the same thing. He does seem at times to want to talk about the way things are. At other times, he just really wants you to just keep hammering it yourself. He wants to make sure you don't ask dumb questions. And it'll only come when you feel close enough to the text that you feel it's talking to you. It has had an effect on you, and that you're going to try your best to communicate that effect to others. And it may be that the language, your native language even, will fail you to a certain extent. When you're talking about deeply moral or religious or spiritual things, I mean, it's hard. Describing an event is very different from describing an experience of an event. And I would say, now you're getting closer to the spiritual. I have no trouble describing what I saw yesterday. Anywhere I saw a green car, and I saw this, and I saw that. But describe well my response to something profound. Words don't come as easily in the same way. And that, I say, that may be where the spiritual or the highly moral, deeply moral spiritual begins entering. And you've got to again, do the best you can with what you've got. And I don't, by any stretch of the imagination, think that most of the time I'm succeeding. Keep trying. But it is important, because you should try to capture the experience that you have. What has, in this sense, not the Buddha, but what difference has Huineng made to you should have some impact on the English you end up using with that. I look forward to reading it, of course, when it comes. Another? Yes, ma'am. Oh, two more, yes. There. You,
Yeah.
yes.
Doctor, in the beginning of your lecture, you mentioned about the filial, the 24 filial stories. So the question is about cultural translation, cross-cultural translation. So can you give us a concrete example? Take one of the story from the 24 filial story. Can you give an example? Well, because I grew up with those stories, I'm used to that, and to me, it's a goal to I have no problem to read those stories, but you say for Westerner to read those stories is very strange or difficult to understand. So how do you translate those stories and still, and to find out the universal meaning, but without missing the action? I mean, those filial son, those actions they did for their parents.
What I said is, I won't translate that because I cannot give them credit. I would not want any of my children or grandchildren to put honey on themselves to get all the insects away from, and a number of the others too. There's just too much self-sacrifice. I don't want to translate much that I have to apologize for. I do have to talk about the most filial person, of course, in the history of China is Shun. Now, working with the Mencius, you must translate Shun. I don't recommend that you really like parents who try to kill you either, or enfeef your brother who tries to kill you, but I'm stuck with that one because it's in a classical text, and I must work with it. And I don't say that the 24 tales shouldn't be translated. I say, I will not translate them because I do not feel that I have a feel for them. If they have done you good service, find a native speaker of English and together translate them. Yes, please.
I wonder if when you do the translation, how much importance you give to image, to think. For example, one word can be understood in the proper way from the people, or maybe can be misunderstood, and how much space you can play. For example, the concept literally somehow you can use the one word, and maybe in a higher level some people can understand, or maybe you change a little bit the word, and pretty much to have pretty much the same meaning, but the more bigger audience can pick up the concept of the context. So how you moderate in that sense? You are flexible to adapt, or just try to maintain more strict on the context? I don't know if I express. So how much you put yourself into the other side? Is everybody understood the concept that they try to explain, or only certain people can understand? And how much you are able to be flexible to play with this?
I'm not sure I understand the thrust. You're saying that almost no matter what term we choose, especially for a key concept, some people will understand it and some will not?
Can no understand, can misunderstand.
Misunderstand.
Can understand something partially different or totally different.
Well, okay, it is part of the importance of translating into your native tongue that you understand the nuances of the key term. If you're pretty sure that in the source language that it has no pejorative connotations, then you must make sure you take an English equivalent that has no pejorative connotations. Beyond that, that is, if a term is all favor, or if it's a mixed term, you ought to try to find a mixed term in the target language if it's there in the source term. But the fact that some people may misunderstand no matter what term you use, I'm inclined to reply quickly. I guess I want to think about it more, but my quick reply would be the same as Samuel Johnson, the dictionary maker. I can only give you arguments, I cannot give you understanding. Kind of thing. I can repeat or paraphrase or something, Or it might be, if it is a complex term, you gloss a footnote or a footnote at the bottom of the page. This is, and that would be an honest thing to do. We flirted with the idea of using this term, but ended up using this term. And if that should happen, my guess is that might lessen misunderstanding. But the more key the concept, I mean, the good thrust of your question is, the more central the concept is to the text, the more you really have to worry about what you're going to, term you're going to give it, and it may not be univocal. Say we translate "dr" as realize, but not all the time. We do use knowledge in a few places, we use wisdom in a few places, and we use acknowledge in several places. The same with li, what ritual will be. Now, with the misunderstanding, yes, li is a particularly tough one because my reading of not simply the Lunyi, but everything I read, is that it has all the meanings that we give it in English every time it's used in Chinese. And that means rituals, rites, R-I-T-E-S, a little bit sometimes even morals, something like morals, mores, etiquette, ceremony, propriety, worship. That's 8 words, and those are very different words. And the Tao Te Ching is even worse. The way that can be spoken is not the unchanging way. It's very different from the way that can be trodden. Is not. Philosophically, those are miles apart. But of course, you're stuck with only one Tao. Which verb do you take, and why? There, you simply have to have a gloss. It is. We do want to take this. Most of the commentators say, don't use the word speak for this Tao in there, although there are 2 passages in the Lunyi where Tao is used as to speak, and in other passages here too. But if the target language, in the translation, the target language looks like it may be subject to significant misunderstanding, you got to put a footnote in. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Maybe provide a little gloss at the beginning in your introduction, something like that. The word is particularly troublesome for us, or was, or things like that. And you may do that with several terms. We have a whole glossary at the beginning of the book of the key 20-odd terms or something. Mm-hmm. Yes, one map. I'll take 2. There are 2. No, it's fine. Sure, keep going.
I have a question. I came across a term that I couldn't translate. The Chinese is 老人家. So I was translating a letter that the Venerable Master wrote to Su Yun Venerable Master. So he called him 老人家, and I couldn't translate that term because I can't use old person, whatever. So my friend, an American, happened to call me, and I told her I couldn't translate this. And she said, how about my dear teacher? So right away the term gave life to that sentence. So I'm thinking the next time when I encounter that term, sometimes father will call their father, son will call their father 老人家, or other, it's a term of endearment, I think.
Yes.
How would you translate that, 老人家?
It would depend on who I was saying it to. It would be very unusual to say father, given that there aren't that many people older than I am anymore. Most of the elders have passed to their reward, whatever it is. But there, the things are changing. I do call people beloved, and that, not sure that my revered teacher or something would also go in there. Beloved might be something I would use. Maybe for some people, depending on who it was, I guess. Yes, sir, you had a question. Yeah.
This may be a strange question, but I'm wondering if there are ethics that you follow when translating, and the difference between translating and writing a commentary on the writings, and the ethics that come along when you translate a text. Does that make any? It's a lot, but I guess it didn't make much sense.
Oh, I see. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that.
That's a good translation, isn't it? And it's a very, very good question. The first of the ethics is you cannot read out of the text the ideas by which you already seized. You must have a basis for the arguments you make. It must always be textual arguments that you can make. Now, you will have some latitude within the range. In the same way we said, we translate Junzi, why, when we told you why exemplary person goes along with the pedagogy of Confucius. There is no notion of number or case or gender. We don't have to use gentlemen. We have arguments. And so therefore we feel we are being responsible translators, faithful scholars, if you will, to the text. Do we take license with the text? Well, yes, we do, but there is nobody that doesn't, we would argue. We say there is no translation without interpretation, as far as we are concerned. A number of our colleagues disagree with us, but we don't find any of their arguments even close to convincing for anything. It's just, you just must attribute this or that. Now, when I'm writing a commentary, then I signal that in different ways as a philosopher. What I am claiming is, or my argument runs like this. If you will follow me in agreeing with this reading of Confucius up to this point, I now want to go on to another claim. And so I do try to make very clear when it is Rosemont that's there as opposed to Confucius, or Confucius as read by Rosemont, or by Rosemont and Ames, or something else. It's a fine line sometime, but we also do, to keep the ethics going, we also do say other people read Confucius differently than we do. Lots of people, a lot of our, probably most of our contemporaries in comparative philosophy are trying desperately to see Confucius as a virtue ethicist, more or less like Aristotle, or a contemporary commentator on Aristotle. We think that's better than trying to make a Kantian or a utilitarian out of Confucius, but it's still wrong. It's not wrong. We think it is more useful to see Confucius as being concerned with the roles we live. The rectification of names isn't names, it's roles, all four of them. The ruler should behave like we know a ruler should behave. The father should behave, not be abusive, but behave like a father should behave. And a son should behave like a son should behave. Now, we just say that's an interpretation. We give arguments, we cite the text, and then we try to tease out its contemporary relevance, how it can serve to look at Kant and Aristotle as well, and Bentham and Mill in a different way. But we do make it clear that other people, good people, disagree with us. That's it. That's all you can do. All you can do. Can we prove our interpretation? No. But neither can anyone else. So we're all in this together. You pays your money and you takes your choice. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So that will conclude. I won't say anything but to say that Henry is always welcome back here, as far as I'm concerned, and I hope You are not the oldest person around, that you will continue to come back. And thank you all for coming. I would encourage you to get the latest copy of his work, even if it's Kindle. Better to read it in Kindle than not at all. And I see the price dropping every day, so it becomes accessible. So again, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Henry, for sharing with us.
You're welcome. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.